So, by a show of hands, how many of you have heard the story in the gospel lesson before? Show of hands, high up. Okay, yeah, it is a pretty familiar story, and it has made its way into our lives in a variety of ways, becoming almost a cultural touchstone. Known as the parable of the Good Samaritan, we have Good Samaritan hospitals, churches of the Good Samaritan, even Good Samaritan laws that protect people who stop to help people who are in need. It has inspired many great artists, including Rembrandt and Van Gogh. And as I learned while doing some research for this sermon, in Australia, there is even a Good Samaritan donkey sanctuary. Did you know, however, that the phrase Good Samaritan doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible? That is a much later phrase that was put on this story. And as I think is always the case, when we hear a familiar story, we are at risk of thinking that we know it. It loses its punch, so to speak. So I want to spend a little time with this very familiar story this morning to see if it has something new to say to us. Now, I don't know if you knew or if you noticed this morning, but Jesus tells this story to a very specific audience. Also, as I always point out to children when telling, this is a story. There is not a historical Good Samaritan. Jesus tells this story in response to a question from a lawyer. Now, for us today, hearing lawyer conjures up specific images of courtrooms and briefcases. But in this first century context, a lawyer was a scholar of Torah, a religious expert, a faithful follower. Now, the first question this lawyer asks Jesus is, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus, as any good teacher might do, responds not with an answer, but a question of his own. What is written in the law? What do you read there? And the lawyer responds by quoting the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. These words are part of the Shema, the prayer that faithful Jewish people to this day pray at the beginning and the end of each day. And Jesus responds, yes, you're right. Do this and you shall live. But the religious scholar has a follow-up question, as lawyers so often do, right? Well, who is my neighbor? And that is the question that prompts Jesus to tell this story that we have come to know as the story of the Good Samaritan. A few things to know. Jesus is crafting a story, and it is rich in details that would have resonated with his first century audience. First, we hear that the man is traveling the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, in biblical times, this road was a well-traveled route, connecting the religious and political center of Jerusalem with Jericho, an important agricultural and trade hub. The road's strategic importance made it a common path for all sorts of people to travel. However, the road was notorious for its dangers. The desolate and rocky landscape provided ample hiding places for bandits and robbers, making it a perilous journey. And indeed, in Jesus' story, the man traveling along the road is attacked by robbers and left half dead. And three people appear. First, a priest. Now, priests were held in high regard in the Jewish tradition, tasked with performing sacrifices, maintaining the temple rituals. They were expected to embody moral and ethical standards. The priest passes by. Next comes a Levite, also a religious leader. Levites assisted priests in the temples. He also passes by. For us modern-day Episcopalians, we can think of the priest and the Levite as the equivalent of our priests and deacons. Jesus' listeners would have 100% expected that these characters would stop to tend to the man. Jesus doesn't give a reason why they don't. Many modern-day commentaries, and you may have heard this at some point, they suggest that the priest and Levite would have avoided the man because touching blood or a dead body would render the religious leaders impure and necessitate them going through certain rituals before being able to resume their priestly duties. However, New Testament and Jewish studies scholar Amy Jill Levine tells us that this interpretation doesn't really hold water and has kind of become almost an anti-Semitic trope, whether that's intended or not. Because Jewish tradition clearly says that saving a life always takes priority over issues of purity. And the detail that they were going down from Jerusalem suggests that they had finished their priestly duties, so would not have been worried about ritual purity. So, if not an issue of priestly purity, why did Jesus use a priest and a Levite specifically? Well, we think it is because there were essentially three categories of the broad people of Israel: priests, Levites, and then Israelites, essentially all of the others, the laity as it were. So those listening to this story would have expected, in the rhythm of folk-telling, that the third figure was to be an Israelite. Instead, Jesus says, a Samaritan comes by. Now, I was always told as a child that the Samaritans and the Israels didn't get along, or that the Samaritans were thought of as outcasts, but it is a gross understatement and simplification. I don't have time in this sermon to go into the history between Samaritans and faithful Jews of the time, but suffice it to say that the conflict between them was deep and ruthless and shared equally on both sides. The Reverend Sharon Sykes Williams asks us to imagine someone who you cannot imagine having one shred of compassion in their hearts, someone incapable of loving God or their neighbor, someone whose essential dignity as a human being and child of God you really have a hard time seeing. That's who we're talking about when we think about how Jews felt towards Samaritans and Samaritans felt towards Jews. They both saw each other as the lowest of the low. I imagine Jesus pausing a bit on the line. A Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. I imagine the lawyer thinking, well, that's the end for this poor man. The Samaritan, if anything, is going to go and finish him off. And then Jesus finishing the sentence. And when he saw him, he was moved with pity. Jesus' words would have hung in the air, appalling and antagonizing the audience. The Greek word translated this morning as moved with pity is a word I've preached on before, splachnizomai, which translates to be moved as to one's bowels. That gut-twisting moment when you feel and acknowledge someone else's pain and desire to do something about it. Jesus says that the Samaritan felt for the traveler in the ditch as deeply as it is possible for one to feel, and acts accordingly, taking care of him above and beyond what we might expect of anyone, much less a sworn enemy. And then Jesus asks the piercing question, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The lawyer can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. Instead, he says, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus says, go then, and do likewise. Notice that Jesus does not actually answer the question, who is my neighbor? Rather, he turns it around and says, how do you act as a neighbor? Interestingly, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about this parable in the last speech he gave on the day before he was assassinated. In reflecting upon why the priest and the Levite passed to the other side, he imagined that the men were simply afraid. And so, Dr. King mused, the question that the priest asked, the question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? Jesus asked his audience to dream of a different kind of kingdom. He was inviting them to consider the possibility that a person might add up to more than their racial, cultural, political, and economic identities. He was calling them to put aside what they thought they knew and to leave room for possibilities. And to leave room for acting, not just feeling. And maybe that's part of why this parable still speaks. It doesn't tell us to wait until we feel compassionate. It calls us to act with compassion, to cross the road anyway, to bind up wounds anyway, to carry the burden anyway. And I think it also calls us to consider ourselves not simply as the Good Samaritan, but also perhaps as the man lying in the ditch. Who would we not want to come by and help us? One of my colleagues asked the question this way: who is the last person in the world you would want to give you CPR? The kind of person you would hate to have to thank for saving your life. An interesting question. There's so much to plumb out of this story, but I urge you to take this story with you, to read it and hear it with the, as Mark Bazzuti Jones likes to say, the ears of your heart. Read it for all the possibilities. May we go forth from this place ready to be neighbors, to consider what that means, ready to cross roads, ready to love as Christ has loved us, and ready to accept the love of those we may not expect it from. And may God give us the courage to live not in the narrowness of the lawyer's question, but in the wideness of the Samaritan's mercy and compassion. In the name of the one who loves us and brings us into life. Amen.